Hello and welcome to episode 9 of No Time to Cry. We're your hosts. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Laura.
And today's episode was actually a request, wasn't it? And we thought, do you know what?
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
Let's be honest. And we were asked to talk about conflict and sometimes if we've personally come across any conflict since losing our parents, and what conflict losing people can create in your network or your families or amongst friends, or all sorts of things really. And unfortunately we have had some experience with that, and the last couple of episodes we've probably spoke a bit more lightly about what we do with celebrations and how we've honoured our parents, and we've not purposefully avoided some of the harder topics. I think they'll come with time after we've had quite difficult episodes about our personal experiences. I think we wanted to talk about some things that maybe weren't quite so deep for us, because it's quite emotional for me and Laura to talk about some of those things. And I'm sure you've picked up by now, we're quite jovial people. We are constantly laughing at each other. A lot of our friendship is built on sort of having a very similar sense of humour, and why we get on so well. And it's not to say that this episode is going to be super serious, because I don't think it will be, but it is covering, what is just some really honest topics that people fall out in after losing people.
It's just a reality, isn't it? And it's important to be open and transparent, because we do want to share that, there is light after death, and, there's still that sadness. And unfortunately, there are some complexities and some complications that sort of happen after you lose a loved one. And sometimes not with the people you'd expect, unfortunately, whether that's friends or family. So we just thought, let's talk about it, because it's something that happens a lot, and I think people feel uncomfortable talking about it. And we respect all of our family and friends, even those that maybe we aren't as close to anymore. So we will, for the sake of that, omit some of the information, because it's not fair to give all of that detail in depth. But at the same time, we just wanted to share some scenarios and some situations that we've faced ourselves, and also some that we have heard about through people that we're close to.
It's not all going to be our deep, sordid secrets and details.
No, yeah.
Some of it we've heard through others, and it might be some stuff that our friends or have gone through, or could have even been things that we've seen online and stuff like that. I believe that there's a lot of... The reason that there becomes a lot of conflict and disputes is because it's quite an emotional time for people. And for some people, death can bring out the worst in them. And it can mean that if you're struggling, particularly dealing with death, we both spoke about it. Sorry, I should knock in the microphone. It's normally Laura. This time it was me. We've both spoke about that. I think specifically you, Laura, you mentioned sort of almost like a grief rage that something's unlocked in you, where maybe you're slightly less patient. Maybe that's also mum life.
Could be. But combination of the two.
Yeah. Where maybe after death you're slightly less... I don't know if patient's the right word, but I suppose it gives you a different perspective where people...
It shifts, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Your priorities shift as well. The way that you view...
What's important
changes. The things that maybe were really important seem more trivial, and vice versa. There's certain things that are amplified, aren't they? That you need to make more effort to focus on that, and maybe worry less about this. And yeah, there is a rage, I think, after you lose somebody, and everyone grieves differently. That's the other thing. So conflict can arise for a number of different reasons. I think if we sort of break some of that down, so as Sam mentioned to begin with, it can be complicated because emotions are so heightened. So there's that, and then everyone's sort of trying to navigate that in their own way. And you might not agree with the way that people that you love perhaps are dealing with it. And again, that doesn't come from a bad place. I think sometimes you just think, a lot of people haven't experienced it before, and then when you're experiencing it together and it's not the same as how you're feeling, it can feel a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, me and my sister had that. I'll talk openly about that because I know we never fell out when my dad passed away at all, but I found it difficult at times because Demi was dealing with things different to how I was, and I'm quite I don't know. I think I'm quite emotionally aware. I can sit there and go, oh, that's not the same as me. I'm not necessarily annoyed about it, but it does make it harder for me to connect with you at this time because we're just dealing with it in different ways. And I think what was interesting is I dealt with it differently to how a lot of people anticipated, and so did Demi. So it was almost like it was a role reversal where I was probably more emotional. Not that Demi wasn't, but was probably the more emotive person. It hit me differently to how you would anticipate, and Demi probably was a bit stronger than everybody anticipated because she is so. I think Demi's like a real empath. She really embodies a lot of emotion and carries a lot of emotion for people, and during that time she just held it together. Maybe it was a response that she had to do that to be able to pull through, and I think from speaking to her, obviously, year or so down the line about it, that probably was the case. But at the time I was a bit like, why aren't you in the same place as me? Why are we not sort of as low? Why aren't we as low together? I think I felt like I was dealing with it not in the best way, but I anticipated she'd be there with me at that same level. And then when she wasn't, I was like, don't leave me behind. Why are you kind of pulling yourself together a bit better than I am? And I think it hit Demi a bit later. A few kind of months later, she really felt it. And that's why we say grief is such a roller coaster, because I think there's now been times where I've probably been in a better place than Demi has, and it's flipped on its head. But that initial first period, she definitely dealt with things
it isn't linear
in a different way,
as we said, is it? So like there are people who go through grief initially and almost act as though, well, they push it away and they just don't even acknowledge or accept that it's happening. And then you get sort of complex grief where it hits you sort of even years down the line, sometimes in some cases, which is quite common in men. Not to be sort of specific about genders, but it can be. But you and Demi, of course, are super close, even closer now. But I think at the time, like you say, you're sort of trying to understand, well, why doesn't this person feel that way? And even as Shan and I said in, I think it was the first episode actually, it's daft things like you're resentful for the fact that the world is still spinning and that people are still going about their everyday life. And the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, life does continue for everybody else and the world does continue to spin, and you feel angry towards that, and then that sort of feeds and filters into your relationships, and
you're just more sensitive as well. It's a time where your emotions are high, so if you're usually someone that can withstand a lot of shit, that tolerance might go from there to down there. So people might be acting with you in a similar way to how they've always acted with you, but now you're going, I can't handle this. Normally I'm able to brush it aside and go, that's just who they are. They're normally like that with me. They're normally a bit short with me. But when you're so overwhelmed by everything else, people's attitudes, you kind of just go, fuck off. I can't, I'm dealing with so much already. The last thing I want is your attitude kind of coming at me. Do you not think I'm going for enough? And I've known people to go back to work and like lose their head with a client and all those kind of things. If you're in a job like customer service or stuff like that, and you're getting it in the ear and someone's going to you, you're rubbish, you're this, that and the other, and you just want to scream back and go, well, my dad's just died, so how bad's your day?
That's almost like nothing else compares at the time, which in some respects might sound really awful and really selfish, but it's true. I think when you go through something as earth-shattering as losing somebody that you love, I think particularly if it's sudden as well, you're fighting a big battle there, because you're going through sort of a trauma response of trying to comprehend what's happened, and the logic just isn't there. And then equally after that, you're trying to navigate the fact that they aren't here, and it can hit you much later on, can't it? And I think with family and friends, it's a bit of it can go one way or the other. The relationships that are super solid and genuinely are really strong will get stronger, and you'll become closer.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that isn't always the people you expect it will be. There'll be some relationships that you have with people that you think are watertight and that won't go anywhere. And, you know, the sad thing is sometimes you completely distance yourself from them, perhaps intentionally, and you don't want there to be bad blood, but it's sometimes the best thing for your own mental health, and maybe to a point for theirs, because the relationship wouldn't withstand, you know, some people just don't understand grief, unfortunately. And that's, like Shannon and I have said before, it's not necessarily that individual's fault, but if you're the person that's going through the grief and you don't feel like you've got the support from somebody that you deeply care about, and you've perhaps been there for them in a number of different ways and they aren't there for you, then you do have to take yourself out of that situation, whether that be with family or friends. It's you know, it's just protecting yourself, isn't it?
I also, I personally, not, maybe we had a couple of conversations and disagreements, but I think when you're trying to plan funerals and stuff, that often is where there's a lot of, I don't think you guys had too much either, but disagreements, and I want to honor this person in this way, and you might have a sibling that wants to do something completely different, or a family member. I know we had a bit of a discussion where one of my uncles wasn't sure that he was going to be able to carry my dad's coffin down, and I said that's fine, but his brother was like, that's not fine, you have to do it, it's your brother, and was kind of really pushing, and in the end he did, right? But it's then that we're going, listen, if you don't want to, you don't have to. Then you've got someone else going, you do have to. It's your brother. You'll regret it for the rest of your life. Blah, blah, blah. And the kind of like little bickers rather than maybe a real conflict.
And your emotions, like we said, are just, they're in a place that they perhaps haven't been before. You're probably quite sleep deprived. You probably haven't eaten anything.
Starving.
Because you just don't have an appetite.
No.
And then, as you say, certain things really start to irk you that probably wouldn't have before. And your tolerance is just at its lowest, because you're just sort of like, nothing else matters. And
there's so much paperwork and all those other things that people don't really talk about. Finances, who's going to pay for the funeral? How are we going to split it? You know, and I count myself lucky that all of us were in a position to just say, right, we'll split it all. And but that's definitely, you know, I've heard of horror stories of people not paying for funerals and people saying they'll put money in and they're not putting money in. And it just brings up a hell of a lot. And also when you have someone that's passed away in sort of difficult circumstances, and there's a lot of shock and there's a lot of questions around, well, what were you doing? How did you know, what was going on? Specifically in my dad's space, obviously some people can get quite angry when people, you know, commit suicide. I don't like saying commit, actually. I really sort of would give myself a slap on the wrist for that, because I don't like that word, because I think it makes it sound like it's almost like a crime. But, you know, there is a lot of anger that can come through it. And I think I said on my episode, you know, anger wasn't really ever an emotion that I personally felt, but that wasn't the same for all of my family, you know. And some of my dad's family did feel some of that anger to begin with, not now, and it took them a couple of weeks to kind of get to a different headspace. And I think the fact that maybe I didn't feel as angry and maybe Demi didn't, I believe that helped some of my other family members come to terms with it a bit more,
can't you?
You know, and have that discussion and talk about things. But you can see how it can implode, and people can kind of take it to that next level and fall out massively. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about, maybe, listen, we're not going to name names, but there's, from a friendship perspective, I felt like you were kind of leading into it a little bit before when you were talking, but Laura and I had a very close friend that we both were close friends if we met, you know, in previous companies together. who we spent a hell of a lot of time with, right? Like tons and tons of time, but went through, maybe in the period of time we didn't have too much that really went. Obviously, I had a lot of stuff with my dad and things like that, but maybe not ever a time where we really needed over high amounts of support from that individual. And I would have said that our relationship was kind of like you said, watertight. I don't know. It's a very difficult situation to talk about without kind of giving, and making, listen, there's no bad blood. We've never fallen out with that individual per se. But at the time when your mum passed away, and probably leading more into when my dad passed away, there was a friend that we probably felt would have held our hand the whole entire time throughout our grief. And actually, it's been over a year since we've now spoken to that individual.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think when you do lose somebody and you're going through that grief, and you do have friendships that can't withstand it or can't help you through it, it is kind of a bit of a natural thing that you do start to lose the closeness, and you almost feel as though you can't approach them. And when you are in a deep state of grief and you're having your really tough days, it's quite common that you become a little bit reclusive as well. So you do sometimes need those friends to be a little bit more forthcoming with checking in a little bit more often, perhaps how you would have done with them, for example. And then if you stop doing that, then unfortunately
just becomes almost like a natural, like we never had any conversations with that individual to say, right, we're no longer friends or we're no longer going to speak. I think we were both going through a very difficult time. We were both very aware, if we've spoken on other episodes, that we were as there for each other consistently, but found those boundaries between us where we couldn't be. And I think we possibly needed that individual to become a bit of a solid ground amongst the both of us while we're trying to work out our spaces. And unfortunately, and listen, no disrespect to that individual, I'm sure it was a very difficult time for them to work out how to deal with it. But because we weren't specifically then reaching out, because we couldn't, we just weren't in a headspace, we didn't have the energy. What then happened was maybe weeks, then months, where we didn't hear from someone that we probably used to speak to daily.
Yeah.
And that's really sad, and that's its own kind of grief, and I don't think anybody talks about grief in friendships, and it's one of the hardest kinds, I believe, because there's no closure. There's kind of that, oh, what's happened? There's this space between us. It's now got to a point where it's awkward to talk about. We're adults, we don't want to fall out, we don't want to have any horrible conversations.
And it wouldn't have been deliberate. So this is the thing, it's no... We've said a number of times before, unless you've been through this type of grief, or any type of grief, actually.
They had lost people, right, including their own dad, and maybe it was triggering for them. I think that could well have been part of it. And I know they had a very different relationship with their family and stuff like that in comparison to ours. I think we want to talk about it, and if this person's listening, please don't feel like we're kind of spreading any negativity towards you or anything like that. But it is a big something that happens very commonly, and I've had other friends that have now lost people that the exact same thing has happened to them. So if we don't talk about it, we're kind of cutting half the story out of what is part of our grief experience and part of our grief journey. And alongside that of losing a parent and dealing with that is the other side of losing some people around you. And it's not just that friend, there's been other people that we've kind of no longer speak to anymore, or family members that we've had to distance ourselves from, and it's difficult. And I think that it's another side of grief. It's just this part of you that constantly wants to go, do I reach out? Do I say something? And there's that bit in the back of your head all the time that's like, what the hell happened? I don't even really know what happened and why we're in that space. And that's happened before grief, right? You've had friendships, Law, where you don't speak anymore and you don't really know why. And as adults, I think we kind of grow apart. I suppose it's like relationships. Sometimes people grow apart in
It's a
relationships
natural
as
way of
well.
life. But it's like we've said,
It's really hard.
it's hard, and it can be really hurtful, and it can be, you can sit there and wonder a number of times over and over in your head and be super analytical about, oh, why has it happened? Could it have been different? And all of those sorts of things. But sometimes in life, it does just happen. Sometimes
Yeah.
relationships do fade for a number of different reasons, maybe for certain circumstances, like we said before. If you're going through the hardest time of your life, perhaps, and you're grieving, your tank's empty, as we've said before, and it's one of those where it is a time when you kind of have to give yourself everything, otherwise you'd fall apart.
Yeah.
And grief isn't the only time when that can happen. It can happen, when you become a parent, for example. There's a lot of relationships and friendships that change when you're suddenly looking after tiny humans. So we get it, but it is really sad, and I think conflict can arise for a number of different reasons, in the respect as well of if people don't necessarily understand what you're going through, people can unintentionally, or maybe sometimes intentionally, let's put that out there too, be quite nasty about it.
Yeah, and so I've seen people push how they want you to deal with your grief onto you. So it's, they have an idea or a picture perfect image of how they expected you to deal with something. And when you don't deal with it in that way, for whatever reason, they get really angry about it and then feel that it's their right to tell you that. And tell you that they don't think you're dealing with it in a particular way. And we've said this so many times, there is no right way to deal with grief. And because I've dealt with it in one way and you've dealt with another, doesn't mean that either of us have done it right. We've done it
it's just how you've
managed to bloody
it.
get through. But there's definitely been conversations where I know, Lo, from your side, and I know the same from mine, where people have said things that you've gone, why the hell have you just said that to me? It makes no sense why you felt the need to share that thought process of how I'm dealing with my grief and how I'm dealing with my grief makes you feel. And and trying to, I had some peculiar things said to me. I fell out with a manager at work, actually, in a previous company, who kind of said something along the lines, when I first came back, initially was great when I first returned, and maybe a couple of weeks in said something like, God, you're so intelligent, but at the minute I just don't feel like we're getting the most out of you. And I was like, yeah, probably because my dad's just died and I've only been back at work like a couple of weeks, and I've been off for, I'm still trying to get my, of course you're not getting the most out of me at the minute. And actually before that, they'd kind of, sung my praises that I'd got stuck back in. But that really upset me, really massively upset me, right? And there was a difficult conversation that I had on the back of that was quite emotive, because normally, I'm quite probably I'm very different. Laura knows I'm quite different at work to how I am outside of work. I'm quite headstrong, to the point. I can take a lot of crap, but at that, it just was like, are you for real? On what universe do you think that that's okay to say to me less than 2 months after my dad's died? Like,
it's mad, yeah.
You're lucky that I'm here. You're lucky that I've come back to work so soon after he's passed away in such a sudden, like, a lot of people would have taken a hell of a lot more time off than I did. And yeah, it just made it it put me in quite a difficult position, because then I was, like, I don't think I want to really work here anymore, if that's your view. So yeah, it pushed me to maybe make some decisions that I wouldn't ideally have done so soon after grieving, but actually it was the best thing that I did. But there was definitely, it felt like a conflict with myself, like an inner conflict as well. Like, is this right for me? Or, I'm going to be grieving my dad anyway. Do I want to be grieving my dad around people that aren't going to support me?
You need people that support you, especially, you spend so much time at work. You need to feel like you've got that psychological safety, and that you're being emotionally supported at a time when you give so much to work and to businesses and loyalty, that that's the one time when they need to show a bit of humanity and be there for you.
And I think what's hard, Laura, is that actually to begin with they did, and it was almost like a when you
and again,
when are we getting you back 100%?
Probably wouldn't have been on purpose.
It wasn't
people
on
just
purpose.
go through.
It wasn't on purpose.
It's people are very much in a business mindset and commercially are just thinking about things, aren't they? And like we've said before, there's no bad blood towards anybody that we're talking about today, because ultimately a lot of stuff is done unintentionally, and it's just sort of how they view things, or it's their perspective on things. But I've even had one of the closest people in my family sort of said, get over it. When are you going to move on? Probably a week in to losing my mum, and I was actually flabbergasted. I just couldn't understand how somebody could have that sort of mentality. It was sort of just like, what?
Yeah.
To a point where I was just thinking, well, I kind of can't. I love you and I care about you very much, but I can't have you around me right now, because that isn't okay when somebody's sort of in a very vulnerable state, in a very, when you're potentially going through the hardest time in your life that you have been so far, or might ever go through for some people, dependent on what else you sort of thrown at in life. Sometimes you've got to remove yourself from those situations, because they can become very difficult, and your relationships can become fractured, can't they? And it gets to a point of, maybe it's not forever, maybe you've just got to distance yourself for a certain amount of time, just while you deal with it, and then you can revisit it at another time. And don't be afraid to do that either. I think there's this big worry sometimes that there's an entitlement that comes with certain roles in families, and that you've got to be there for somebody because they are who they are ultimately by title, but that isn't true.
I want to specifically talk about that in the presence of when you've lost a family member. There's almost like a bit that comes with it afterwards that's like, oh, well, then I should put up with anything from other family members, or people have that, oh yeah, but it's your brother, or it's your dad, or it's your mum, so you should, just you've just lost your mum, or you've just lost your dad, so you don't want to push another family member out, and you have some of that self-doubt yourself, but you also have a bit of narrative from other people kind of going blah blah in your ear as well. And actually I disagree with that hugely, because I don't think anybody chooses to step away from a family member unless they really need to do it to protect themselves and other people are around them,
even more so when you've lost a family member.
Exactly. And you wouldn't choose to do that again, because there's another side of grief, and I've spoke about it, the fact that I had to take a step away from my dad when he was still alive, and the grief that I felt, and like I say many a time, the amount of money I spent in therapy to do that, it's hard. It was hard, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. So for someone to kind of trivialize it and say, oh well, are you sure you want to kind of step away from that person as well when you've just lost somebody else? Guess what? I've kind of put a lot of thought into it.
The reality is as well, you don't want to step away. In no world do you want to step away from people that you've had really great relationships with, whether it be friendships, whether it be family members. It makes you, when you do lose someone, it makes you realise how precious life is, and how important and especially relationships
people.
Are.
So much more. People.
So much more.
And you keep the ones like, listen, I feel like me and Laura probably will, regardless of what happened, we are bonded in so many different ways now, including probably some sort of trauma bond. But it's, and I will hold Laura close to me for the rest of my life. But I think there is, when you've got people around you that carry you through, you really hold them. And then when there's people that maybe don't quite turn up for you in the way that, like you said, Laura, you would do for them, or you have done for them, or you anticipated they would, because there is so much love between you, it's a bit like an extra dagger to the heart. Would they call it, like, kick a man while he's down? Like, it's
really heartbreaking.
It is, and it adds to that, because but then I think there's a side of it that goes, I'm glad I know this now, because for friendships, for instance, you could have spent another 15 years building friendships with that people and really embedding them into your life, and then you found out 10 years later that they never would have been there for you when shit got bad. Like, you kind of have to go, well, maybe I needed to see that, because maybe I didn't realize that, because I've not had anything particularly that I needed to know. And I always think maybe it's a bit of a blessing or a message that comes from your loved one that goes, I think you need to see this before you kind of go a bit further with this relationship. And that could be partners as well, right? We've spoke quite candidly about how lucky we are to have partners that were really there for us during our grief, but bloody hell have I seen the opposite with some people close to me, where their partners have done exactly what you've said, Laura, and a week or so in gone, you need to just get a grip now. You need to pull get yourself together. We can't just have you moping around the house. And it's like, well,
yeah, wow. It's like you said previously as well, Shannon, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said choose a partner that will be with you when you lose a parent. It's the same goes for family and friends. I think in that respect.
Listen, blood doesn't mean that person's gonna turn up for you every day and do for you what you
and
need.
it's okay if they don't. We're all human. Like, there's absolutely times when we'll both hold our hands up. We're not perfect people. There'll be times when we've not been good partners, times when we've not been good friends, times when we've just not been good to our relatives, whatever that looks like. But it's important to just be able to be reflective and to take accountability for that. And even if you don't necessarily agree with how somebody feels or what they say, just have a little bit of compassion for them, especially when you go through grief. Because if you've never been in their shoes, then never say things like, oh, you just need to get back to work, or the world doesn't owe you anything, or you just need to move on now, which is seriously things Shannon and I have had said to us. That's never going to be like, what are you hoping to gain out of saying that to somebody? Is what I'd always say as well. Just try and just be a little bit mindful.
Think before you speak.
Yeah, because believe it or not, when you go through this sort of stuff, you want to be able to be a little bit more normal. You don't want to feel completely heartbroken and just like you're suffocating and like you can't breathe some days, because that's how awful it can be, isn't it?
Yeah, and like you said, there's some things that you think, gosh, that I'm sure they didn't mean that. But there's other things that people say and you go, what were you meaning if not that? Like, I think I had someone say to me, does it feel like a weight's lifted now that your dad's died? Like, of course it doesn't.
Yes.
What did you think I was going to reply to that? And bearing in mind, that was the day he died as well, right? I got asked that the day he died. And I just was in such shock. I just was like, no, I don't know what you want me to say other than no. Of course, if
it's
anything,
like the worst
it's
possible
like
outcome.
And you kind of think, have you seen that TikTok? It's like, they're talking about their pets and they're like, wonder what's going on inside his head. It's almost like that moment where you go, no way you just asked me that.
Yeah, are you okay?
Like, are you all right? There's no way that those words just came out of your mouth. And I suppose it just gives you a bit of insight to the way that everybody's brains work
Some people are wired so differently, but that's why we've said, there is conflict that you make a conscious decision at that point, don't you? You've got to be cognizant of what's happening, and if it's a close family member or a close friend, you've just got to decide and make a conscious decision of, it's either going to lead to conflict if it hasn't already, or you need to take yourself out of the situation so that it doesn't cause further upset and make things irreparable as well, because sometimes things can be said that absolutely there's always going to be that forgiveness, but there'll be other times when it gets to a point where actually you can't forgive it.
I think you have a lot of lenience as well, like we as people, it takes us a lot to take a step away from people. People probably would have said to me with my situation with Dad, why did you let it go on so long before you took a step away and all those sort of things. But actually, you're a human being. You want to give people a chance. You like to think the best in people. You like to think, maybe they're really struggling at the
Yeah,
moment.
and that's true as well.
Yeah, and I think there was periods of times with friends and family members where we've maybe cut them a lot more slack than other people in our life would have liked us to, where we've gone, no, they're not like that. They won't be meaning it. We'll keep trying. Oh, I'll message them again. It's like, well, you're the one that's lost someone. Should you have to keep trying to message them and make sure they're okay at such a difficult kind of time in your life? And, you'll try. And there comes a point where you go, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I didn't know that individual as well as I thought I did. Or maybe you go, well, I'm just going to take a step back myself and see what happens and see how that individual reacts. And then
it sometimes comes to a natural conclusion.
Yeah,
doesn't it,
exactly that. And I think there's relationships where at some point they've all got a sell by date, and sometimes they just they don't last as long as you thought they would. And the family stuff's hard because I think there's then the sometimes some family members fall out with others and then you don't, or there's conversations, or even like at funerals where you have people there that maybe you don't speak to anymore, and you've got to kind of manage that. And there was a bit of that at my dad's funeral, not from my side but from other individuals that were there. But I just believe on that particular day everybody has a right to say goodbye.
Everyone was there for your dad, and that's what you've
exactly got to... And you've got to kind of make space for that and put any hard feelings aside. And I'm grateful to my family members that did do that, because the last thing you would have wanted was like one of them, you've seen the worst, like on people having fights at funerals and stuff like that. Yeah. Like I just couldn't think of anything worse. And thankfully everybody that kind of was involved with any of those situations put all of that aside on the day and celebrated my dad and came together. But there's also another side of things which can get quite messy, is like the financial side. And people, gosh, this reminds me, years and years ago, my great aunt passed away. A partner of, I can't remember how, second cousins or something like that, I can't remember, was at her house. I don't even think she had passed yet. I think she was sick, and was like basically pricing up her belongings. Like, and this just, some of these traits come out in people when people pass away. They're not with that person anymore, thankfully. But people, there's a saying like, where there's money there's muck, and that does unfortunately come out.
So it's scarily common as well. Like, you start to see traits and sort of mannerisms of people, you just think, wow.
Yeah, like, why are you even worried about what finances or whatever? They've just passed away. Let them rest. And if you are due anything, then someone will come and tell you. You don't need to be...
Even people, like you say, like I know somebody whose gran was actually unfortunately poorly and sort of at end of life, and they had a cousin from that she had
pop up from nowhere.
Suddenly
long lost cousin, like, oh, any money for me?
Yeah, like, it was really bizarre, and it did sort of turn out that that's kind of what they were after, because this particular lady was quite wealthy, and I just thought, what? It's just it's sickening.
Yeah, and there's awful. Some people that truly believe that they are owed something for, I just can't think of anything that was going on in my mind less than whether I would or wouldn't receive any money when my dad passed away. But there was some other people in my dad's kind of realm who were focusing on that and thinking about that outside of the family. And it just was, I just thought, surely you've got better things to be worried about when you've got no more, you've got no ties to my dad anymore, and maybe you did years ago or whatever it is, but you certainly shouldn't be thinking about if you can financially benefit from my dad's death. And you wouldn't believe, like I said, I'm not gonna share any of the in-depth details, but you've seen some of the messages and conversations that have gone on, and it honestly just enlightens you to a whole different world of the way that people's brains think. And luckily that was very small amount of conflict, because I just wouldn't lower myself, or nor would any of my other family, to allow us to let that kind of overrule what else we were dealing with at that time.
Yeah.
But you can see how people get into legal battles, how people kind of get very bitter, and it almost becomes that is what becomes a bigger conversation than the fact that somebody so important to so many people is no longer with us.
And it ruins relationships. Think, as we've said before, we've been really lucky. Like, we have siblings that we're really close to, and that hasn't caused issues. But I've heard of it between literally brothers and sisters that will fall out over, you know, finances in terms of the estate that a parent might have had, or the assets. It's just like it's
really difficult, because I can't relate to that at all.
Thank we're really, and you know, we're really lucky, because that is, again, it's a really frequent thing. Like, the amount of people that will think that they're owed more and will definitely try and get more, even family members.
I thought I was going to get past a load of debt from my dad.
I mean, do you know what's crazy? And this is something that I'll just say now for anybody who's a new mum or dad, because I didn't know this until I had kids. One of my closest friends, her mum passed away when she was only 38. So she didn't have a will written. And she was married, and she'd been married for 2 years, I think. And at the time, my friend was a teenager, and a young teenager. And because her mum had been married for 2 years, her husband got everything.
Yeah.
So, you know, her children, who were teenagers, didn't have a house to live in, didn't have anything to financially support them. And it absolutely blows my mind that somebody could do that to children, to the children of the person that supposedly you loved and married and was your wife. And that terrifies me. So I'd just say, for anybody who has children, even if you're young, the sad reality is nobody knows what's going to happen in life. So just make sure you've got you've got a will, that you've got beneficiaries that are listed for anything like pensions that you have, so that your wishes are considered.
Yeah, because pensions is a big one, because it just goes to, essentially, if, like you said, if you're married, then
next of kin
and your spouse, or and that can mean that your kids actually get nothing whatsoever. And then if you've got a partner, like you said, Laura, that wants to be particularly difficult, they can basically make sure that your kids get nothing. So the other side of it is, I might be wrong, but I think in your will you can also, you know, like if you're separated, or, you know, touch wood, you know, this never happens, but it definitely has, where both parents have passed away at the same time, maybe in an accident or something like that. And if you don't make a note of anywhere as to where you wish your children to be left, so if you know, say you've got a grandparent or something like that, that person potentially can end up meaning that your kids go into care for a period of time. Whereas if you have a wish for your children to go to a particular family member or friend, and that's written down, I believe that makes the process a lot easier. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't have almost financial things to leave behind, if you've got children, I do recommend, and obviously seek legal advice, we're not lawyers by any means, of kind of saying, well, if both of us for whatever reason pass away, who do we wish the children to kind of to be their guardian? Because otherwise, unfortunately, you can end up with kids that get kind of pushed from pillar to post.
Yeah, it's so true, and it can cause a lot of unnecessary stress and conflict. And again, it's one of those things, I think, wherever possible, it's preventable, isn't it? So you want to get to a point where there isn't that sort of scenario. And it's the same for, like, you know, critical and life and cover, that sort of stuff, so that if you're ever poorly or if you were to pass away, that your partner is supported with mortgage payments and that sort of stuff, because finance can cause a lot of stress. And that's actually something that I saw a lot before mum passed away, of previous, like, friends who have lost parents, where that seemed to be the biggest cause of conflict
I
and
agree.
stress and arguments, which is really, really incredibly
It's
sad.
sad.
But there are so many people that I know that aren't close to.
Most of it's money related,
Yeah,
unfortunately. Like, as sad as it is, but money makes the world go round, right? And I appreciate why at times especially if you've lost a partner who was the breadwinner, right, and then you're a stay-at-home mum or something like that, I can understand why it would be really important, the financial side, and we definitely.
But nobody's owed it. I find that
No.
that's the one thing that I've always had a couple of disagreements on is not, again, not with my family actually, but when I've spoken to other people who have lost loved ones and they've talked me through their scenario of somebody saying to them, I think I'm owed this, or I should have had compensation for how this person was in my life, and I used to sit there and think, it's obviously very, very sad when people have been through complex relationships and have been through trauma, and there's no getting away from that. Obviously, it's very sad that people go through that, but it doesn't then mean that you should be the main person to financially benefit over other people, because you've probably been through the same thing as well. And nobody owes you anything really in terms of that, and it can cause so much friction, can't it?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot, when people own businesses and when they own properties and all those kind of things, and people put, I've known some very strange wills that I've come across within kind of friends or families, things like, well, you can, if that person that passed away owned the house, you can stay in the house, but only if you never remarry. And
yeah, that's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, some really odd. And I think the further you go back in time, the more
you never know what will happen. I mean, I think this is a lovely thing actually that my mum and her partner did, but they both had wills, and they have children from previous marriages. My mum had 3 of us, and my mum's partner had 2 children as well. And it's a really completely fair, the way in which they've worded the will. But one of the things it did say was that in the event that my mum's partner actually is quite a bit older than my mum, so he wanted to make sure, bless him, that she was protected if ever he was to pass away, because the likelihood is, just given their ages, that he would pass before her. Unfortunately, of course, that isn't what happened, but it was written in such a way that if one of them was to pass, that they would still be able to have the house, and that they'd still have what they needed financially to continue to run the property and that sort of stuff, which I thought was really nice, because they've thought about each other and made sure that...
Yeah, because still your partner, right? You might have kids, but you love your partner and you want to make sure that they're...
You don't want them to be homeless. And that is a genuine concern and a consideration that... unfortunately, it does come to things like mortgages, particularly if you're not married.
Mm-hmm.
There are some complexities around, who has what, and that's when it gets difficult and people argue, and you just want to avoid that wherever you can. So
massively so.
Just look after yourself and your loved ones.
Yeah, and listen, I think this has been one of those episodes where we've kind of spoken personally about stuff and other bits that aren't personal to us, but we've definitely experienced. But unfortunately, there is a lot of bad stuff that comes alongside losing somebody that's not just grief. There's we spoke about it a little bit on last episode. There's a lot of admin, and then there's a lot of relationships stuff that you have to deal with, and it's just hard work. And that's why people say, why does it take so long to kind of come to terms with the fact? It's because it's not just that. There's so many other things that you're having to deal with. And
it changes as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I don't think that's just with when you lose someone. If you get divorced, it's similar. If you break up with somebody, who's going to get the house, who's not going to get the house, what are we going to do? Are we going to sell it? Are we going to buy each other out? Anything that involves process seems to cause some form.
Yeah.
Not for everybody. Some people are able to get things done amicably. And I think in the most part, we definitely were. I think our stories and our experiences are probably
we've been
very
fortunate,
minor in comparison to a lot of others. So, probably some people will listen to what me and Laura have said today and go, God, that's like nothing in comparison to what I had to deal with when, you know, this person died, or even when I split up with somebody, or whatever it is. So
But know that, you know, you absolutely aren't on your own if you're thinking, gosh, why are relationships breaking down and are people turning against each other in families and
yeah, and
friendships, because it happens
people say some
frequently.
weird stuff, right? I was speaking to somebody the other day who unfortunately lost someone in a similar way to how my dad passed. And, you know, that's the great thing about this podcast, is it's really allowed us to connect with other people that have lost you know, family members, people that I've not spoke to since, you know, maybe I was in school and stuff like that. But they've fallen out with one of their best friends because, you know, similar to my dad, they'd had some difficult times with the person that they'd lost. And you're talking about trivial in comparison to, you know, what I went on with me and my dad. But, you know, you could say that they're kind of trivial tit for tat arguments and conversations that you have with people that you love. And, you know, their supposed best friend said to them, you know, why are you even so upset? You didn't even like that person. So that's where you kind of have to go, do you know what? My true best friend and someone that loved me would never say something like that to me. It's such a difficult time where, unfortunately, those kind of thoughts and feelings go through your head anyway, even if, you know, of course you're going to be upset that that person that you loved.
The guilt that you feel, even if you had a really
I
great
know, and
relationship.
you know, nobody gets on 100% of the time. If you don't have little bickers, especially with family, like if you know, me and my sister have bickered over the years, God knows how many times over, they're my straighteners, no, I want this, you know, whatever, over the years when we've grown up. If she had, you know, passed away, you know, I would have been devastated for years and years and years, let alone if she had taken her own life. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, wow, why would you even if you fought it, what compels you to let the words come out of your mouth, you know?
Crazy.
So yeah, I think it's clear that it's not just,
it's just a lack of understanding that. And, you know, again, you know, I'm sure some people are thinking, stop making excuses for others saying this sort of stuff, which we get, but you do have to have a level of understanding that some people genuinely don't mean what they say. And, you know, we've heard some like atrocious things, haven't we?
Yeah.
Like, you know, even when I posted a tribute to my mum after she died, somebody in my family thought that I was posting about my mum to upset them. When I was just trying to remember my mum who had just passed away and it was her birthday. But yeah, it just, people obviously go through some crazy thoughts themselves, and you know, they're obviously entitled to think what they do and to have their
and listen, all of us are different, right? And people deal with, you could almost say, I think me and you are very similar, where we always try to go, is there a reason why they're doing that? Like, can I think of a reason why someone might, not looking for excuses. I think you're right. You've got to make sure that you're not doing that and enabling people. But listen, we're all very complex creatures. Humans are all very different, and I think sometimes you have to be mindful. And then there's other times where you go, do you know what? I'm drawing the line.
Yeah,
there's too much here going on. I need to just call this a day. And like you said, Laura, maybe at some point you go back to that individual and you're able to rebuild relationships when you're in a different headspace and you're not. And other times you go, do you know what? I think that's just where we're going to call it, right? If you can't be there for me at the worst time of my life, so I don't just want somebody in my life, family member or friend, that's only going to be there when it's good. I need people around me that are going to be there for the ups and downs, right? And when you get married, they say in sickness and in health, better for worse, but your friendships are the same.
Yeah, and you do have to choose your battles. Like we've said before, you know, there could be friends that, you know, perhaps aren't being supportive of you throughout your grief because they perhaps are going through stuff themselves and they don't realise. So you've got to make allowances for things that perhaps you don't have a full understanding of, or, you know, at a surface level, you know, you kind of wondering why.
Yeah, don't be rash. Don't be like, oh my God, that's the first sign of them not being there for you. You kind of go, right, cut off, done. But I think you get the signals and the signs.
Sometimes it's recurring, and if it's constantly a conversation of, you know, you need to move forward, you need to sort of get past it, that kind of stuff, and they're continuing to do that when you're in a really bad headspace. And the best thing that you can do, obviously, is that you just have to protect yourself at that point, because otherwise it's just going to make you, you know, you're already in a state of like complete pain and shock
Yeah.
and sadness, and you want somebody to help you to feel a little bit lighter and to reassure you that everything is going to be okay and that you will have better days, and you don't want anything to add to the stress of thinking, gosh, does life ever get any better? Because it does, but you need to be surrounded by people that
Bring you
that good energy, and you know, you've got to do the same for them, right? You know, it's a two-way street, but yeah, it's just important to pick up on those signals, I guess, and to think about whether it's worth fighting for, or actually, is it just best for things? Is it best for you to sort of part ways?
And we always say to this to each other all the time, you know, like as friends, when that individual is interacting with someone that we don't think is particularly being good to them, it's like, what would your mum say?
Shan says this to me all the time.
What would your mum say? What would your mum say if you went and spoke to your mum? What would she say to you? And she said, well, she'd tell me to do X. Right, well, then what the hell are you playing at? Because she'd be fuming to know that you're putting up with X, Y, Z, and hear that voice in your head. And I think the same about my dad, right? And I used to say things to my dad all the time in a similar way, like, how would you feel if this person did X, Y, Z, Dad? Come on, you know, blah, blah. And you have to think, sometimes having that kind of step out and putting yourself into somebody else's shoes and going, if it was the other way round, what would they do? Or if this was, you know, and it just goes, no, you're right, because they'd say X, Y, Z. And if my mum said it, I'd listen to it, you know. And it's kind of having that different side.
They're the friends you need to have, though, right? The people that, you know, will make you think about, well, put yourself first in certain situations, because you're probably not quite the same as me in this respect, Shannon. I think I'm better at it, but I'm an awful people pleaser, aren't I? I've always have been, to the point where it's a bit daft, actually. But that is one of the things that I think losing mum has changed for me, because I'm not a confrontational person, and obviously I think most people try to avoid conflicts, but I've now got to a point where if I don't think something's quite right, or if I'm upset by something, I'll give it the opportunity to get better. But ultimately, you do have to make a decision at some point as to whether it's worth staying there, or just taking yourself into a completely out of the scenario, or setting boundaries, like you said before, like making it clear what's needed to improve the relationship. And if that doesn't happen, then you've just got to
100%.
to do what's right.
So. Therapy will tell you that. It will tell you that. But yeah, thank you everyone, and Happy New Year, by the way, because I think this will be our first episode of the new year. Oof. Unless I've got my dates wrong.
2025.
I know. Hopefully it's a year of love and no conflict for everybody.
Yeah.
You know, let's wish that for the year ahead. But yeah, again, really appreciate the support that we had last year and all the messages that we received, and tons and tons of love and the opposite of conflict that we kind of had since launching this podcast. And it's been a mad couple of months and a weird journey for us as well, but we're really enjoying it. You know, it's been a real positive thing for me this year, and this year's still been particularly hard for me and Laura for grief, and this is probably one of the things that I'm proudest of that I've done this year, because it's been good for me personally, but it's so lovely to hear the impact that it's having on so many of you, and we're really grateful for you guys telling us that as well.
Yeah, we really are. And as we've said before, if there's anything you want us to cover, anything in particular that you're struggling with, or you just want to sort of hear our perspective on, or some views that we can share from other people, then please let us know, because we'd love to be able to help.
Yeah, and if I think we said it last time, but if anybody's interested in coming on as a guest or anything like that, reach out and we'll have a conversation about it, because I'm sure at some point you'll get sick of just hearing us two natter on. But like we said, we're going to have a guest on in a couple of weeks, so we will tell you about that in a bit more detail. But yeah, have a lovely new year, I suppose, and we're looking forward to kind of hearing more for you guys in 2025. But like I said last time, if you haven't subscribed already, what the hell are you playing at? We're on TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook,
Instagram.
And love you all lots. See you later.
See you soon.